Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Greidick. I'm Dr. Martha Greidick. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. Certainty in life is something that we all seek. We can think of certainty as a form of safety, and that's something that's very normal for everyone to want. And this is no different when we talk about our personal lives or the workplace. We all need a certain level of certainty, certain level of safety when it comes to our workplace experience. Whether we're talking about physical safety, whether we're talking about psychological safety, or whether we're talking about something such as job security, it's all equally important in terms of certainty at the workplace. When certainty or safety of any kind is lacking, we tend to feel stressed and or anxious. When that experience of feeling uncertain or lacking that safety of certainty is something that we experience over a prolonged period of time, it can have quite an effect on us. It can affect our health, both physical and psychological. In other words, a lack of certainty, especially in a prolonged situation, can lead to negative effects on our well-being psychologically, physically, and emotionally. When we experience that kind of lack of certainty, and when we look at the workplace specifically, things such as inability to focus or loss of focus and loss of productivity also have to be taken into consideration, because those are very real in terms of what lack of certainty can do to an individual at the workplace for their workplace experience. Lack of certainty can also affect things such as professional growth and development. I think you're starting to see how certainty, feeling of safety at the workplace is critical for our well-being and our performance at work. But the reality of life and the reality of work is that there are certain variables that are out of our control. Some things we may have control over, some things we may have some control over, or at least some influence over, and yet there are other things that we simply have little to no say in or no control in. And this may be especially visible when you work for an organization, when you work for someone else. So things such as downsizing, or the organization's loss of business, or getting fired, or getting passed over for a promotion, all kinds of things can really influence your ability to feel that sense of certainty, that much needed sense of safety at the workplace. But many of those are out of your hands, out of your control. That in itself can contribute to an exaggerated interpretation or an exaggerated feeling of lacking certainty at the workplace. That brings me to the next point, which is the fact that certainty and lack of certainty will affect people differently. Everybody has a different threshold when it comes to how much uncertainty they can handle and how they will react to it or how it will affect them. So that's important to remember, that different people will be able to handle different levels of certainty, and different people will deal with certainty differently in terms of how it affects them and how they respond or react to it. So there are two big takeaways here when it comes to this topic of certainty and the workplace. One, it's important to understand how critical a sense or a feeling of certainty can be at the workplace, despite the fact that there is no guarantee that everything will be a certain done deal, that everything will come with a guarantee. There will always be some amount of uncertainty in life, and that includes the workplace. But we have to remember the importance of certainty, because it is when that threshold is crossed, when certainty is lacking to a degree that starts to affect us beyond just moderate effects, that's when we need to understand what's happening in terms of our feeling of certainty or lack thereof. The other important takeaway is this, that despite of the fact that there are many variables in life, including those at work, some of which we have control over, some of which we have maybe some control or some influence over, and some of which are completely out of our control. It's important to know that there are some things that you can have influence over, and even when you deal with those variables over which you have no control, there are still things that you can do in order to make that particular variable of uncertainty less impactful on you, less damaging to you, less stressful to you. A good place to start with this is to start identifying those things about your work experience, about the work environment, that you would consider to be the most uncertain, or ones that lack certainty the most. Again, there will be things that will be more certain than others. So identify those things that stand out in terms of a lack of certainty in your own personal experience. It's always good to start with a baseline, understanding what you're working with, understanding what you're up against. Once you are able to identify some things that contribute to your feeling of uncertainty at the workplace, you have to be honest with yourself. You have to consider your own filters, your own perceptions. Are other people seeing the same levels of uncertainty as you are? And yes, there is something to be said for an individual experience, as I've mentioned earlier, but you also have to be able to be honest in your own assessment and be able to identify things that maybe are not as uncertain as you think they are, if the majority of other people around you or everybody else around you is not reacting to them in the same way that you are. That's not to say that if your reaction or your perception is different from everybody else's, that your perception is not valid. That's not what that means at all. But you have to be able to make an assessment and come to a conclusion in such a way that you're doing a fair assessment, that you're being honest and real with yourself. Remember, it's all about your own lens through which you see things, but contributing to that lens are things such as your experiences, your biases. So be honest with yourself, and only you can know what other factors may be contributing to how you perceive a situation. Even people who know you very well may not know everything from your experiences, from your past, from your biases. Only you can be 100% honest with yourself in order to make a good assessment of what are those things at the workplace that you consider to be the most uncertain, that keep you up at night, that give you an uneasy feeling or bring stress into your life? Once you identify a couple of these things, be honest in the next assessment, in that it's important to know which of these things you can affect or influence, which of these things you can change or control, and which of them are completely out of your control. I think you can see how critical it is to have an open-eyed assessment about that. If you're kidding yourself about how much control you have over something, where maybe you don't have as much control or influence as you think, or if it goes in the other direction and you are seeing yourself as a victim of circumstance and think you have no control or no influence, that could hurt you, whichever way the interpretation goes. So once you identify some things that bring uncertainty into your workplace experience, consider what influence or what effect or what ability to change you have for each one of those things. And once you have that mapped out, or once you have that identified, then you can act accordingly. For those things that you can change, by all means, create a plan of action and change them. For those things that maybe you only have some ability to change or maybe influence, that's a different way that you would approach it. And of course, for those things where you identify that they're completely out of your hands, there's nothing you can do about it, your approach there will be different too. It will have a lot more to do with your own reaction, with your own response to it, and your own preparation for a potential situation. So you may be thinking, what can I do to improve uncertain situations, or to improve or increase the certainty in some situations at work? Well, it's good to have a plan of action and then actually to take some kind of action to follow up on that plan. And if things are such where you have no control over them, then it's up to you to identify how you can accept that, how you can be at peace with that. Doesn't mean you have to like it, doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but you are much better off not allowing things to keep you up at night, especially things that you can't change or can't do much about or anything about. It's about, at that point, it's about finding your own inner peace with them and your acceptance of them, whatever that means to you, because it will be different things to different people. In those situations where there isn't much that you can do to change the level of uncertainty about something, you may want to start thinking about working on your resilience, working on coping skills and coping mechanisms. That will be a good way of addressing that, rather than just throwing your hands up in the air and saying, well, I'm powerless, and feeling defeated. Empower yourself by preparing for a situation that may come sometime in the future and dealing with the reality of the level of uncertainty that you may be facing. So again, resilience and coping mechanisms are important here, as is regular self-care. When we're dealing with tough things, self-care becomes that much more important, because that's when we realize, when we are lacking self-care, how much it would help us to take better care of ourselves so that we could deal with life situations. It's also important to have a contingency plan of action. Sometimes things happen that are out of your control. Sometimes they are completely unexpected. They're complete surprises. It's good to know what you would do if something like that were to happen. That's why you've probably already heard about being, for example, being financially prepared. If you lost your job, if you couldn't work, if something happened to you in terms of your health or physical abilities, have a financial backup to be able to survive for a certain length of time until you can figure things out. It's along those lines, having a contingency plan of action for those things that you've identified as high level of uncertainty in your workplace experience, and things that you can't do much about, or you have no control over, you have no influence over. If you have a contingency plan, you might be able to find that acceptance and peace, because no matter what happens, you'll feel better prepared to survive and move forward. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. The feeling of certainty is something that we all need and we all seek out, and that includes the workplace experience. We want to have that feeling of certainty, a feeling of safety, but as is the case with life in general, sometimes there are plenty of variables at the workplace which seem riddled with uncertainty, things that are out of our control, out of our influence, and maybe things that we can't do much about. But the important takeaway with that reality is that you can do things to make your experience better and more certain for your own benefit. From identifying those things that may feel particularly uncertain or lack certainty in your workplace experience, to working on either influencing and changing those circumstances, those particular things, or figuring out how to make peace with those things you have no control over, and having backup plans or contingency plans, all the while making sure that you work on your coping mechanisms, your resilience, and you continue to take care of yourself so that you are well equipped in terms of your physical, mental, and emotional health to deal with whatever life may throw your way, whether that's at the workplace or anywhere else. As the week unfolds, I invite you to think about what are those things at your workplace that maybe give you a sense of uncertainty or are not as certain in terms of what you would like them to be. Consider whether there are things that you can do, whether you can change things, whether you can influence things, or if things are completely beyond your control, whether you can work on how you perceive them and how you can make peace with the reality of those uncertainties. From there, you may want to consider working on a contingency plan of action in case something happens with one of those things that you identify as lacking certainty in your workplace experience. What could you do? How could you prepare yourself to deal with that if that should ever happen? For those of you who experience this podcast in an audio-only version, I invite you to check out my YouTube channel, Stress Free with Dr. G, where you can find the video version of this podcast. In addition to the podcast, you can also find videos that focus on stress management. So I invite you to check out Stress Free with Dr. G on YouTube. The link for that is in the description below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.